Few topics in Christian faith generate as much confusion as the relationship between grace and obedience. Grace is celebrated, and rightly so. Obedience is often feared and frequently misunderstood. Between these two words lies a tension that has shaped centuries of theological debate, personal anxiety, and spiritual misunderstanding. At the center of this tension stands one question that many believers quietly wrestle with. If we are saved by grace, why does obedience still matter? For many believers, obedience feels dangerous. It feels like a step backward toward legalism, fear, or religious pressure. Some associate obedience with earning favor, proving worth, or living under constant evaluation. As a result, grace is sometimes defined negatively. Grace as freedom from commands, grace as release from expectation, grace as exemption from responsibility. But Scripture does not define grace this way. A subtle distortion occurs when grace is treated as permission rather than transformation. Grace becomes a shield against discomfort, a justification for disengagement, a way to avoid the cost of obedience. This version of grace feels comforting, but it quietly empties grace of its power. It rescues from guilt, but leaves the heart unchanged. Scripture offers a deeper vision. In the biblical story, grace is never the finish line. It is the starting point. Grace rescues before it instructs. Grace forgives before it forms. Grace invites before it commands. But grace never leaves the invited unchanged. To separate grace from transformation is to misunderstand both. Many Christians imagine faith and obedience as opposites. Faith feels inward. Obedience feels external. Faith feels personal. Obedience feels imposed. But Scripture never sets these against each other. Instead, it presents obedience as the visible expression of faith, not its replacement. Faith that does not shape behavior remains incomplete. Obedience threatens autonomy. It asks the believer to trust God's wisdom over personal preference. It challenges the idea that sincerity alone is sufficient. It calls for alignment, not just affirmation. This is uncomfortable, especially in a culture that equates freedom with self-definition. Scripture offers a different understanding of freedom. Biblical freedom is not the absence of boundaries. It is the presence of right order. Freedom in Scripture means being released from destructive patterns so that life can be lived as intended. Obedience is not the enemy of freedom, it is its structure. Grace restores the capacity to obey joyfully, not fearfully. Few commandments expose this tension more clearly than the Sabbath. For some, the Sabbath represents legalism. For others, it represents loyalty. For many, it remains confusing or irrelevant. The Sabbath becomes a test case for how grace and obedience are understood. Is it a burden imposed or a gift received? Scripture consistently frames it as the latter. The Sabbath is often reduced to a rule. Do this, do not do that. But Scripture presents the Sabbath as something deeper, a rhythm of trust. To keep the Sabbath is to declare that life does not depend solely on human effort. Rest becomes an act of faith. Grace does not only forgive sins, it retrains desire. It teaches believers to stop striving for worth, to stop proving identity through productivity, and to stop treating life as a performance. The Sabbath embodies this grace in time. To rest is to trust. Obedience without relationship becomes legalism. Relationship without obedience becomes sentimentality. Scripture holds the two together. Obedience flows from relationship, not from fear. The Sabbath, in this light, is not a test of loyalty. It is a practice of intimacy. It is time set apart not to impress God, but to dwell with Him. Not, do I have to obey? But, what kind of obedience does grace create? This question shifts the entire conversation. It moves obedience from obligation to response, from pressure to privilege. This script will not argue the Sabbath as a condition for salvation. It will explore the Sabbath as a gift that reveals how grace reshapes life. It will not pit faith against obedience. It will show how faith gives birth to obedience, The idea that law and grace are enemies did not begin in Scripture. It arose from fear. Fear that obedience would replace trust. Fear that commands would overshadow mercy. Fear that grace would be diluted by responsibility. But Scripture does not frame law and grace as rivals. It presents them as participants in a single redemptive movement. When law is treated as a ladder to earn salvation, grace must oppose it. When grace is treated as permission to ignore transformation, law must resist it. Both errors distort the biblical story. Scripture never asks believers to choose between law and grace. It shows how grace restores what law could reveal but not repair. The law was not given to save. It was given to reveal. It names what is good. It exposes what is broken. It clarifies what love looks like in action. By itself, the law cannot heal the heart, but without it, the heart has no compass. Grace does not erase the compass. Grace repairs the heart that uses it. Where the law identifies the problem, grace provides the cure. Grace forgives what the law exposes. Grace empowers what the law commands. Grace restores what the law protects. This sequence matters. Grace does not undo the moral vision of the law. It fulfills it by making obedience possible from the inside out. Legalism obeys to earn acceptance. Grace obeys because acceptance has already been given. The direction is reversed. In Scripture, obedience follows grace the way fruit follows life. It is evidence, not currency. When obedience flows from gratitude rather than fear, it ceases to be legalism. It becomes love made visible. Jesus does not abolish obedience. He deepens it. He refuses a shallow righteousness that measures holiness by external compliance alone. He calls for a transformed heart that naturally expresses itself through faithful action. Grace, in his teaching, does not relax obedience. It relocates it from pressure to desire. Grace that demands nothing, eventually forms nothing. When obedience is dismissed as unnecessary, faith loses shape. Belief remains internal, but life remains unchanged. Scripture resists this by insisting that living faith expresses itself through action, not to prove faith, but to embody it. In Scripture, the law is described as good, not because it saves, but because it teaches. It offers structure for life with God and with others. When removed from relationship, it becomes harsh. When embraced within grace, it becomes life-giving. Grace restores the law to its proper place as guidance, not threat. The Sabbath sits at the intersection of law and grace. If law is viewed as oppressive, the Sabbath becomes a burden. If grace is viewed as exemption, the Sabbath becomes irrelevant. But when law is understood as a gift and grace as empowerment, the Sabbath becomes a practice of trust rather than a test of worthiness. Not, do I follow the law or live by grace? But, how does grace teach me to live? This question dissolves the false conflict and restores the biblical rhythm of redemption followed by formation. The Sabbath was never meant to be a burden, yet for many believers, it feels like one. It is discussed as a requirement to meet, a boundary to police, or a rule to defend. When framed this way, the Sabbath becomes a test of loyalty rather than a gift of grace. Scripture offers a different vision, one where rest is an expression of trust, not a measure of worth. When obedience is separated from relationship, practices turn into performances. The Sabbath, instead of being a sanctuary in time, becomes a scoreboard. Questions shift from, how does this restore me, to, am I doing this correctly? Anxiety replaces joy, and rest becomes work. This inversion does not come from Scripture, it comes from fear. In the biblical story, rest precedes exhaustion. The Sabbath is introduced not after human failure, but at the beginning of human life. It is not a remedy for sin alone, it is a rhythm of creation. This order matters. Rest is not earned after productivity. It is received as part of being human. To rest is to acknowledge limits and to trust God within them. Rest is not passive. It is an act of trust that life continues even when we stop striving. In a culture shaped by productivity and proof, choosing to rest feels risky. The Sabbath challenges the belief that our value depends on constant output. Grace invites a different confession. God sustains what I cannot. The Sabbath does more than pause activity. It retrains desire. It interrupts cycles of accumulation, comparison, and control. Over time, it teaches the heart to want what restores rather than what exhausts. This transformation cannot be forced. It is learned through practice. Grace does not demand rest. Grace makes rest possible. Rules feel manageable. They offer clarity, boundaries, and a sense of control. Relationship, by contrast, requires attentiveness and trust. When faith drifts toward control, the Sabbath is reduced to checklists. What was meant to be relational becomes transactional. Scripture resists this reduction by framing the Sabbath as a sign of belonging, not a condition for acceptance. When the Sabbath is received as relationship, rest changes shape. It becomes time set apart to remember who God is and who we are not. It is a weekly refusal to define identity by achievement. In this light, rest is not inactivity, it is alignment. The Sabbath becomes a confession, lived in time. When rest becomes a test, two outcomes follow. Some live in anxiety, fearing failure. Others disengage, rejecting the practice altogether. Both outcomes miss the heart of the Sabbath. Scripture offers a third way. Receive rest as a gift that forms trust over time. The Sabbath is not only personal, it is communal. Shared rest resists exploitation, slows collective pace, and protects the vulnerable. When communities honor rest together, they declare that people matter more than production. Grace shapes not only individuals, but shared life. The Sabbath does not demand perfection. It invites consistency. Even imperfect rest, practiced faithfully, reshapes priorities and heals disordered desire. Formation happens gradually, through ordinary rhythms sustained over time. Grace works patiently, not, "Am I keeping the Sabbath correctly?" but, "How is this practice teaching me to trust?" This question moves the Sabbath from scrutiny to sanctuary. Obedience reveals what faith has already begun. It does not create faith. It does not replace faith. It does not compete with faith. In Scripture, obedience grows where faith is alive. Where faith is absent, obedience becomes either fear-driven compliance or quiet rebellion disguised as freedom. Many believers fear obedience because they have experienced it without grace. They have known commands without compassion, expectations without relationship, rules without rest. Under these conditions, obedience feels oppressive. It appears to threaten joy and individuality. Scripture acknowledges this fear and then reshapes obedience entirely. Biblical obedience begins with trust. Trust that God's commands are not arbitrary. Trust that God's wisdom exceeds our limited perspective. Trust that life ordered by love leads to freedom, not confinement. When obedience flows from trust, it becomes responsive rather than reactive. It expresses relationship rather than anxiety. Compliance asks, "What is required of me?" Faithfulness asks, "How do I live in alignment with love?" Compliance seeks minimum standards. Faithfulness seeks truthful living. Scripture consistently calls for faithfulness, a posture of the heart that naturally expresses itself through obedient action. Faith that never shapes behavior remains abstract. It may comfort, it may inspire, but it does not transform. Scripture insists that living faith becomes visible, not to impress others, but to give faith a body in the world. Obedience gives faith weight and texture. Grace does not only forgive wrongdoing, it reorders desire. Over time, obedience trains the heart to want what restores rather than what exhausts. This is not forced discipline. It is gradual formation. Practices like Sabbath rest reshape instinct, teaching the soul what freedom feels like. Obedience becomes cooperation with healing. Transformation does not happen through insight alone. It happens through practice. Scripture understands this deeply. Habits shape character. Rhythms shape identity. Obedience practiced gently and consistently forms a life aligned with truth. Grace supplies motivation. Practice supplies direction. Some fear that emphasizing obedience diminishes grace. Scripture shows the opposite. Grace that never leads to obedience remains incomplete. Obedience that does not arise from grace becomes hollow. The two belong together, not as cause and effect, but as root and fruit. Remove either, and the life of faith loses balance. Love responds. When trust deepens, obedience follows naturally. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but sincerely. Scripture frames obedience as an expression of love, not a mechanism of control. Where love grows, obedience follows. Not, do I obey enough? But, what is my faith producing? This question shifts attention from performance to formation, from measurement to meaning. Grace does not leave life untouched. It forgives, and then it forms. It welcomes, and then it reshapes. It restores, and then it reorients. When grace is received fully, it does not end the journey. It begins a new way of living. Grace reorders priorities. What once demanded constant striving begins to loosen its grip. Identity shifts from performance to belonging. The need to prove worth gives way to the freedom to live truthfully. This reordering is not instant. It unfolds gradually as trust deepens and fear loses its authority. The Sabbath becomes more than a weekly pause. It becomes a confession repeated in time. I am not sustained by effort alone. My value does not depend on productivity. My life is held even when I rest. Oh, this confession trains the heart to live from grace rather than anxiety. Rest shapes the soul in ways insight alone cannot. As grace reshapes the heart, obedience becomes embodied faith, not flawless obedience, not anxious obedience, but sincere alignment with love. Choices change, responses soften, priorities realign. These changes are often quiet, visible more in consistency than intensity. Grace does not demand spectacle. It cultivates faithfulness. A life shaped by grace is not a life without struggle. Old habits resist change. Fatigue returns. Fear occasionally reasserts itself. Scripture does not deny this reality. It invites patience. Growth is uneven. Formation takes time. Grace remains active, even when progress feels slow. Faithfulness is measured over time, not moments. Grace rarely forms people in isolation. Community provides perspective, encouragement, and correction. It protects against both self-righteousness and self-deception. Shared practices, including rest, remind believers that faith is lived together. Grace creates people who belong, not individuals who perform. The life and teaching of Jesus hold grace and obedience together without tension. He invites the weary to rest. He calls his followers to live differently. He offers forgiveness and expects transformation. In him, grace is neither permission to remain unchanged nor pressure to earn acceptance. It is the power to live truthfully in freedom. When grace, rest, and obedience are held together, faith can breathe. It no longer oscillates between fear and indifference. It settles into a rhythm of trust, practice, and renewal. This rhythm sustains faith across seasons, joyful and difficult alike. Such faith is resilient because it is rooted in grace. Not, am I doing enough? But, am I living from grace? This question redirects attention from self-measurement to trust, from anxiety to alignment. You are not saved by obedience. You are shaped by grace. You are not asked to earn rest. You are invited to receive it. You are not called to perform faith. You are called to live it. When grace leads to rest, and rest nurtures trust, obedience follows naturally, not as burden, but as love made visible. And this is the life Scripture invites us into, a life of faith, formed by grace, sustained by rest, and expressed through obedience. Many believers do not struggle with belief. They struggle with exhaustion. They believe God is gracious, yet they live as if everything depends on them. They trust God's forgiveness, yet they cannot rest from self-judgment. This tension reveals not a lack of faith, but a faith that has not yet learned how to rest. Grace invites faith to slow down. Rest is often misunderstood as avoidance. But biblical rest is not withdrawal from responsibility. It is a realignment of responsibility. It reminds the believer that life is not carried alone. To rest is to practice dependence, not passivity. This kind of rest strengthens obedience rather than weakening it. Transformation rarely happens through dramatic moments. It happens through small, repeated practices. Asterisk, choosing rest when anxiety urges productivity. Asterisk, choosing honesty when image feels safer. Asterisk, choosing obedience when convenience is tempting. These practices form character quietly. Grace works patiently through consistency, not intensity. Many believers confuse conviction with condemnation. Conviction invites change with hope. Condemnation demands change with shame. Grace teaches obedience without humiliation. It allows failure without despair and growth without fear. Obedience practiced under grace is resilient because it does not collapse under imperfection. No one keeps perfect rhythms. Life interrupts, schedules fracture, fatigue returns. Scripture does not respond to this reality with accusation, it responds with invitation. Grace does not ask, "Why did you fail?" It asks, "Will you return?" Returning is more important than maintaining appearances. Rest, learned alone, is fragile. Shared rhythms protect against both burnout and isolation. Community reminds believers that faith is lived together, not managed privately. Practicing rest in community resists cultures of competition and comparison. Grace creates space for shared humanity. Lasting obedience grows slowly. It is shaped by patience, supported by grace, and sustained by trust. This obedience does not need constant affirmation. It becomes part of who a person is, not just what they do. Such obedience is quiet and strong. One of grace's greatest gifts is permission to be unfinished. Faith is not a completed project, it is a lived relationship. Scripture does not demand arrival, it invites faithfulness. Being unfinished is not failure. It is evidence that formation is still happening. Some believers benefit from a simple rule of life, not rigid rules, but guiding rhythms. Regular rest, asterisk honest prayer, asterisk embodied obedience, asterisk shared life. These rhythms do not earn grace. They help us live within it. Instead of asking, "What must I do?" try asking, asterisk, "Where is grace inviting me to rest?" Asterisk, "What small act of obedience feels life-giving rather than heavy?" Asterisk, "How can I trust God with what I usually control?" These questions form a gentle but faithful posture. If faith has felt heavy, grace invites rest. If obedience has felt frightening, grace invites trust. If rest has felt undeserved, grace reminds you it is a gift. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are being formed. Grace does not rush this work. And that is good news. Many believers assume that rest requires ideal conditions. More time, less responsibility, fewer demands. Scripture does not wait for ideal conditions. It teaches rest within pressure, not after it disappears. The Sabbath does not remove responsibility. It places responsibility within trust. Rest practiced in imperfect circumstances is often the most formative. Rules demand precision. Rhythms allow adjustment. Grace forms rhythms, not rigid systems. When life becomes unpredictable, rhythms flex without collapsing. This is why Scripture emphasizes patterns of life rather than detailed regulations. A rhythm of rest survives change. A rule often breaks under it. Obedience is rarely dramatic. It looks like asterisk choosing truth when exaggeration feels easier, asterisk choosing rest when anxiety demands productivity, asterisk choosing faithfulness when recognition is absent. These choices rarely feel heroic. They feel ordinary. Over time, They form a life that quietly reflects grace. Not everyone will understand a grace-shaped life. Some will call rest laziness. Some will call obedience rigidity. Some will call restraint weakness. Scripture prepares believers for this misunderstanding. Faithfulness is not measured by consensus. It is sustained by trust in God rather than approval from others. Comparison erodes rest. When faith becomes competitive, grace is replaced by performance. Scripture consistently redirects attention inward, not toward self-absorption, but toward discernment. What is God forming in your life? What rhythm sustains your faith? These questions guard against imitation without understanding. Grace is not only for beginnings, it sustains middle seasons. It carries fatigue. It steadies faith when enthusiasm fades. A life shaped by grace is not defined by constant spiritual intensity. It is defined by perseverance, marked by trust. This is mature faith. Even grace-shaped lives stumble. Old patterns resurface. Rest is neglected. Obedience falters. Scripture does not respond with alarm. It responds with invitation. Grace does not shame failure. It redirects it. Return matters more than perfection. One of the church's ongoing challenges is teaching grace without dissolving responsibility. Grace taught without formation produces passivity. Obedience taught without grace produces fear. Scripture holds both together through relationship. Obedience grows naturally where grace is trusted deeply. Instead of asking, am I doing enough? Am I keeping this correctly? Ask, is this rhythm drawing me toward trust? Does this practice produce peace or pressure? Is obedience flowing from love or fear? These questions keep faith grounded and honest. A life formed by grace becomes stable, not rigid. It can bend without breaking. It can rest without guilt. It can obey without fear. This stability does not come from certainty about everything, but from confidence in God's character. If faith feels fragile, grace is not disappointed. If obedience feels slow, grace is not withdrawn. If rest feels incomplete, grace remains patient. You are not late. You are not disqualified. You are not expected to finish what grace is still forming. Grace leads, rest steadies, faith responds. Obedience follows, and over time, a life takes shape not impressive, but faithful.